Well, hello dear comrades, and welcome back to this close reading of Slow Down by Kōhei Saitō. We are still reading from the first chapter, Climate Change and the Imperial Mode of Living. Last week we described the current situation, the current climate crisis. It was like giving a diagnostic, like we know how sick the planet is, and we know what is causing the illness. It is capitalism. We explained how capitalism functions and how, what is its role in the climate crisis. We explained that the climate crisis is the result of emissions in greenhouse gases, and those emissions, well, they are the product, they're the result of capitalism, because capitalism creates this relationship between a core and a periphery, in which the periphery extracts value from, the core extracts value from the periphery, and then shifts back the burden of this extraction to the periphery, which causes the exhaustion of the periphery. And this whole process of extracting value from the periphery is what, causes these emissions of greenhouse gases, and therefore causes climate change. So the cause of this illness is capitalism. As Saito says, all capitalism has ever done is shift the costs and burdens of resource extraction onto the peripheries it has created. The ill effects of the contradictions in the system are displaced onto distant lands, while actual solutions are put off again and again. So that is the diagnostic, and there is no reason to believe that governments and industries want to do anything about it. All the plans that they suggest are all smokescreens. Now, they are just attempts to make us believe that something is being done about the situation, when in reality we only have cover-ups and distractions to maintain the status quo that is literally, leading us all to, basically Armageddon. But this doesn't mean that that no one foresaw the state of affairs. As a matter of fact, someone has pointed out this inherent nature of capitalism in creating peripheries from which it can extract resources, and then shifts back to the periphery the costs and burdens of that extraction process. So this injustice, along with its ecological and necessary consequences, was already known in the 19th century by the one and only Karl Marx. Already back then, Marx had a name for these shifts of costs and burdens. He calls them displacements, but it's not just a shift of something from one place to another. No, it's also ideological. The shift is made in such a way that the thing it shifts is rendered invisible. Capitalism doesn't want to shift costs and burdens only. It also shifts something else. It's contradictions, which manifest themselves through the costs and burdens. But also, capitalism doesn't want people to see those contradictions. I mean, capitalism doesn't really want anything. It's a system. It's not like it has wants and desires, but you get the point. For it to function, it needs to hide its contradictions. The contradictions, we already mentioned them. In order for capitalism to deliver what it promised, it needs to exploit workers and natural resources to the point where it can no longer deliver what it promised, because, the workers and the natural resources get exhausted. Hence, it is necessary for it to hide that contradiction and make people believe that it is, 1, delivering what it promised, 2, that it does it without injustice, and 3, that it can always deliver so that no one questions capitalism's efficiency. But Marx has already seen through capitalism's bullshit, and so Saito writes, Marx's main point was this: capitalism displaces its contradictions elsewhere and thus renders them invisible. This displacement only makes the contradictions worsen, deepening the quagmire into an increasingly disastrous state of affairs. Capitalism's attempts to displace its ill effects can only result in collapse. According to Marx, this is the ultimate insurmountable limit of capital. So, there are 3 types of displacements or shifts that Marx identified. We can also say that there are 3 types of contradictions that capitalism displaces: technological, spatial, and temporal. So we're going to start with the first one. So, according to Marx, the first displacement is the technological shift. And how does it work? Well, do you remember Nordhaus's discussion about the miracle technology? We saw that last time. It's like, you know, you leave the market do its thing, and it will drive innovation into finding a technological advancement to overcome the environmental crisis. Well, we will actually, you know, come back to this because I mean, okay, so we have. To understand this, we actually have to talk about an influence, a big influence on Karl Marx, a guy named Justus von Liebig, or Liebig in English. It's spelled Liebig. And I mean, we will come back to this guy when we will talk about Saito's first book, Karl Marx Eco-Socialism. But we need to say a few words about him, and especially about his notion of robbery of the soil, because it is very important to understand how a technological shift works. So, robbery of the soil is basically soil depletion due to agriculture. Liebig said that in order for plants to grow, the soil needs to provide those plants with the necessary nutrients to feed them, like inorganic substances such as phosphorus and potassium. So those nutrients, they form naturally by the natural breakdown of rocks and are then converted to forms usable by the plants. The problem is that this process of breaking down the rocks, naturally speaking, takes a very long time, and therefore any amount of nutrients necessary to sustain plant growth will always be finite, meaning that there is a limit on how much a soil can produce plants and feed them properly. So there has to be a balance between the nutrients that the plants consume and the plants, which determines, you know, the soil's fertility. A soil is more fertile than another if it has enough nutrients to sustain more plant growth than another. So to maintain that fertility, it is crucial to always give back the soil those nutrients that the plants consume. In other words, you need fertilizers to compensate the consumed nutrients so that your soil remains fertile. And so this is what Liebig calls the law of compensation, which states that agriculture can only be sustained if the nutrients, or sustainable if nutrients in the soil are sufficiently replaced. And there are a few ways to sufficiently replace those nutrients. You can replace it through waste. When we consume those plants, our waste can serve as a fertilizer. So it is crucial to place that waste back into the soil because it contains the nutrients for plant growth. One way or another, your soil needs to have the proper nutrients. But what happens when the nutrients that are consumed by plants don't go back to the soil? Well, your soil loses its fertility. It's the depletion of the soil because it is being robbed of its nutrients. This is what Liebig noticed when agriculture becomes profit-oriented. Two main problems emerge with capitalism. First, the division of labor creates a separation between country and town, meaning between farming villages and urban centers. What's produced on the farms must be sold to people living in cities, where they consume and digest the products, but then they flush down the waste in their toilets that expel them into rivers and streams, or into the sea or oceans. Thus, the nutrients in the waste don't go back to the soil. And so that's the antagonism between town and country, which we will spend quite some time explaining in a few weeks. And so the second problem now is that capitalism, since it can only sustain itself through short-term profits, because the long-term capitalism goal, that's a myth. Don't believe anyone who tells you that he can make a business run on long-term goals. That's completely false, in capitalism at least. So since capitalism can only function through short-term goals, it cannot afford to wait for that time of, rock breaking down. Capitalists want the same land to produce quickly rather than wait for fields to follow to allow their nutrients to be renewed, because that means losing profit since the process takes a long time. So capitalism needs to always cut costs to the bare minimum. It will keep funds to maintain soil fertility like irrigation systems to the bare minimum. So the soil is forced to produce beyond its capacity, and it's also forced to produce in shorter and shorter periods to meet the expectancies of capitalism. In other words, nutrients are always extracted from the land, but they never go back, which leads to an exhaustion of the soil and of the land, which causes a rift in its metabolic cycles, in the metabolic cycles of the soil, this is another term that we will spend a lot of time explaining in a few weeks. So for the sake of short-term profitability, we sacrifice long-term sustainability, which eventually lead to the collapse of the soil and lands become barren. So unable to produce food to sustain it, well, the civilization will eventually collapse. And so this is what Liebisch's prediction for Europe was. Europe will collapse under its profit-oriented agriculture. We will explore this dynamic in much more detail when we go through Saito's book, Karl Marx's Eco-Socialism, especially the 5th chapter, Fertilizer Against Robbery Agriculture. So we will come back to that. So anyways, this is the contradiction of capitalism. And so capitalism wishes to survive this contradiction, and so it needs to come up with a solution to solve it. Its only way is to find how it can keep generating short-term profits, without, robbing the soil of its nutrients. And again, there is no other solution for capitalism. If it tries to find solutions for long-term profitability, it's no longer capitalism. Long-term economic growth isn't economic growth, but we will also go back to that. So now this is its only solution. If capitalism wants to survive, its only solution is to find a way to keep making short-term profits, but without the robbery of the soil. That's the solution to the contradiction. And well, that solution was said to be found. It is the discovery of the Haber-Bosch process by which ammonia can be created industrially, a discovery that allowed large amounts of chemical fertilizer to be made at a low price. But this discovery did not in fact heal the rift produced by the contradictions of capital, it merely displaced its effects. So what does that mean? Well, this discovery was made in 1910, when a demand for artificial fertilizer was increasing due to the realization that to sustain, profitability and produce as much as we do, we need way more than the natural reserves of natural fertilizers can provide. And so this is where two chemists found a way to synthesize ammonia, which is like a colorless gas essential for things like fertilizers. So these two chemists are Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. Haber demonstrated the process of producing ammonia from air in 1910, and then the German chemical company BASF, which is a European multinational company and the largest chemical producer in the world. So this company purchased the process by Haber and assigned Bosch the task of scaling up Haber's process to industrial scale, which he did. And so this earned both chemists the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1918. So what does the process really do? Well, it produces ammonia, which is made of nitrogen and hydrogen and can be made on a large scale, which can be used as fertilizer so that the soil never runs out of nutrients. So this is an example of how technological innovations find solutions to capitalist contradictions. Europe doesn't have to collapse. Liebisch was wrong. Our way of doing agriculture for short-term profit is saved. This, however, is wrong because although nitrogen is abundantly found in the air, the problem is hydrogen. Hydrogen, in order to produce it, to make the Haber-Bosch process, you need to extract a lot of fossil fuel, okay? Because hydrogen is extracted from fossil fuel. And then, according to an article from the University of Tokyo that Saito refers to in note 19, the footnote 19, once you get the hydrogen, you then have to chemically combine it with nitrogen at temperatures of about 400 to 600 degrees Celsius and pressures of about 100 to 200 atmospheres to make this ammonia. And so this also has, great energy costs. And not just that, but to produce enough of it to satisfy worldwide farming, the amount of natural gas used to create ammonia this way has to constitute 3 to 5% of the world's total output, around 1 or 2% of the world's entire energy supply. That's a lot. Now, the source that Saito gives also states that there is a researcher at the University of Tokyo, a certain Nishibayashi, who found another way to synthesize ammonium through a method called samarium water ammonia production, or SWAP, SWAP. And so this process creates ammonia at 300 to 500 times the rate of the Haber-Bosch process and at 90% efficiency, and can be performed on a tabletop chemistry lab, whereas the Haber-Bosch process requires large-scale industrial equipment. Basically, you take nitrogen from the air, but instead of hydrogen, you use electrons from samarium combined with protons from water, and this supposedly gives you ammonia. I don't know, I'm not a chemist, but this is what the article says. And Saito doesn't address this swap process at all, but I think it will run into the same problems as any other fertilizer and would also imply displacement. The name of the article, if you want to read it, is "Researchers Dramatically Clean Up Ammonia Production and Cut Costs." So, to go back to Saito and to quote from him, in other words, modern agriculture replaces the original nutrients in the soil by using up another non-renewable natural resource. And of course, the production process also emits large amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This is the fundamental nature of the contradictions produced by technological shift. Furthermore, the development of industrialized agriculture that uses large amounts of chemical fertilizer has led to myriad other issues caused by nitrogen compounds polluting the environment, from nitric acid contamination of groundwater to the red tide blooms caused by the eutrophication of aquatic ecosystems. In this way, technological shift eventually triggers large-scale environmental problems ranging well beyond the simple exhaustion of a single tract of land. So in order to make the technology that doesn't rob a soil of its nutrients, we need to rob another soil of its nutrients in order to make this technology. This is what basically Saito is saying. And on top of that, the production process of this technology is highly polluting. It's like you end up with a technology that, it doesn't pollute, but to create that technology, you need to pollute even more. And so this is displacement. You didn't solve the contradiction, you just put it somewhere else and on somebody else's shoulders. And it doesn't even end there. As Saito points to yet another problem with the overuse of fertilizers like ammonia, that is, they disturb the soil's ecosystems because they're not used to ammonia. Chemical fertilizers make, for example, soils lose their ability to retain moisture and expose crops and livestock to diseases. It turns out that the natural fertilizers were also part of a larger metabolic interaction between the plants and livestock, and changing the nature of those fertilizers, switching from natural ones to artificial or industrial ones or chemical, fertilizers, can have side effects detrimental to your livestock and crops. So on top of having to buy the fertilizers, because of course you have to buy them since they are made by private companies who are also looking for profits, you also need to buy products to counter the side effects and diseases to which your livestock and crops are now vulnerable, while at the same time the demand grows, which means that you have to buy more fertilizers every year, which means that you also need to buy more agri-chemicals and antibiotics, etc. We also mentioned this vicious cycle in which farmers find themselves trapped to last time, leading many to commit suicide. And let's not forget that many of these chemicals end up leaking from the soil into the broader environment and disturbing ecosystems when they contaminate rivers, streams, and other water resources. And if you think that companies give a shit about this, well, you'd be wrong, even if you try to impose sanctions on them. Most of the time they can avoid all accountability and responsibility by simply delaying verdicts, by claiming that no cause and effects relationship can be proven between their actions and the empirical data about the state of the environment. So they can avoid offering any compensation to those affected by their chemicals, and even if they are found guilty, the damage is already done. No amount of compensation can bring back the land to its original state, and so it remains unusable. And so, to quote Saito again, the technological shift does not solve problems. Rather, the excessive use of technological solutions only deepens the contradictions underlying those problems. So now we move to the second displacement, the spatial shift. And so this too can be understood through soil depletion. Now, as I said, the Haber-Bosch process was discovered in 1910, so about 30 years after Marx's passing. Before that, the law of compensation was assured by natural fertilizers, even though everyone knew that the natural fertilizers would soon run out. But the reserves of fertilizers aren't distributed equally. Some places have more than others. Europe, again, to sustain its production and profitability from the time, of Marx, already knew that it doesn't have enough natural fertilizers, so it had to go get it from elsewhere. So at that time, the most common natural fertilizer to replenish the soil was guano. Now, guano is dried seabird shit, and it is extremely rich in key plant nutrients. It has nitrogen, which is essential for leaf and stem growth. It also has phosphorus, which supports root development and flowering, and then potassium, which helps with overall plant health and resistance to disease. But it is abundant in Latin America, more exactly in Peru, where huge populations of seabirds gather off the coast and deposit enormous amount of excrement here, creating a petrified, concentration of sediments as big as whole islands. Actually there are 22 islands. We call them the Guano Island of Peru, and they are now a protected area. Of course, you have the indigenous population who uses that guano for their agriculture, but then come the Europeans who were just passing by, and they were just, exploring, trying, to learn about the world because knowledge is good. And so, as he was exploring through Latin America, a German explorer, Alexander von Humboldt, stumbles upon guano and discovers its marvelous utility for crops. So everyone from Europe and also the United States were like, we found the miracle stuff that will save us, let's take it. And so, yep, that's a classical colonial move. And so you had vast amounts of guano exported to the US and Europe farmland to be sustained and continue to produce, the foodstuff necessary for the urban workforce. Your workers in cities need to eat and be able to run your machines, right? But how was that guano exported? Well, by exploiting the shit out of the local population, of course. In note 20, Saito gives a book as a reference for the whole situation there. It's by historian Frederick B. Pike, the United States and the Andean republics, Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And so Saito focuses on page 84 of the book, which is the section about Peru in the fourth chapter, the 19th century quest for stability and progress. And more precisely, it's in the section, The Age of Castilla and Guano. So that's Ramon Castilla, the three-time president of Peru, and called the liberator because he abolished slavery and modernized the country. But before saying that's a good thing, let's see what Pike, the historian, actually tells us. First, we can say that it was the exploitation of guano which allowed the country to be economically secure enough to abolish slavery. The guano-derived, revenue, transformed Peru's economy and politics to the point where it enabled the abolition of slavery in 1845 through compensations to slave owners, which the government afforded through guano exportation. So between 1840 and 1860, Peru became one of the leading exporters of guano. By 1860, it was exporting 400,000 tons annually, worth over $24 million. Initially controlled by the British firms like Anthony Gibbs and Sons, the guano trade brought immense wealth to the Peruvian government, which retained ownership of the reserves and reaped the lion's share of profits. The government allowed firms to control the trade, but in exchange of taxes, and that's how the government grew its economy. With it, it financed a standing army, public works, a growing bureaucracy, and even financed wars, notably against Ecuador, but also Spain, which we will go back to in a minute. So you would say that's a good thing and an example of capitalism working. But when we investigate the details, well, not so much, because under Castilla, who ruled from 1845 to 51, and then again from 54 to 62, Peru may have enjoyed relative political stability, largely thanks to guano wealth, but that's only when you look at the GDP, which only grew because Castilla avoided taxing the capitalist elites, fearing, political backlash, and instead followed laissez-faire economics. And so this showed that he wasn't, that different from his predecessor, whom he, by the way, overthrew. So his predecessor was Jose Rufino Ekenike, I think that's how it is pronounced, or Echenike. Anyway, so his predecessor, he ruled from 51 to 54, and I'm gonna say Ekenike. I should have checked how his name is pronounced. But anyway, so Ekenike was technically only following what Castilla initiated, because Castilla ruled before Ekenike, and then Ekenike took over, and then Castilla overthrew Ekenike to rule again. So the guano trade under both fueled the rise of a native capitalist class, so many enriched by corruption under Ekenike, and led to the importation of Chinese laborers to replace free slaves, those who were the slaves who were freed by Castilla right after he overthrew Ekenike. Paike, talks about 90,000 Chinese males important to meet Peru's labor needs for agriculture and railroad construction between 1850 and 1875. Castilla's strategy simply consolidated his power among, business elites and land owners. Even, managed to establish also a cotton export economy and increasingly challenged British control, eventually taking over guano concessions by 1862 and founding Peru's first commercial bank. But it also ignored long-term development planning and left Peru dependent on volatile export markets and important goods. So by the 1860s, Lima's coastal bourgeoisie dominated national politics, and the emerging plutocratic aristocratic class, formed through alliances between old aristocrats and new capitalists, they marginalized intellectuals and internal critiques. So in hindsight, Castilla's era was marked by both short-term success and long-term vulnerability. If at first sight the story looks like a man who fought against British imperialism to give back his people's sovereignty, in reality he just created a capitalist elite class that kept trading the guano resources with that imperial entity that he was supposedly fighting against. And so the end result is a future economic collapse loomed once the guano reserves dwindled, because of course the extraction of guano also led to the destruction of the birds' nests, leading to a massive drop in their population, which led to a massive decline in the guano reserves. And so what happens when you have a colonial power trying to exploit a faraway land to the point where you realize that its resources are becoming more and more scarce? Well, you get wars. There were the two famous wars known as the Guano and Salt Pepper Wars, respectively from 1864 to 66 and 1879 to 84. They are also known as the Chincha Island War and the Pacific War. So salt pepper is also a natural fertilizer made of sodium nitrite and is abundant in Chile. And also in Bolivia and also southern Peru. So the first one was directly colonial. It involved Spain, who was trying to revive its colonial empire. Spain had lost its South American colonies in the early 1800s, and the Chincha Island War was a clear attempt at reasserting colonial influence. So under the pretext of debt claims and protecting Spanish citizens, Spain seized the guano-rich Chincha Islands, effectively treating Peru like a former colony that it could still control. And so this was seen across Latin America as neo-colonial aggression, which provoked a unified regional resistance from Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And so the war symbolized Latin America's continuing struggle to assert sovereignty in the post-independence era, particularly over natural resources still coveted by former colonial powers. And the second war, this one was between the independent nations, but it was still shaped by colonial legacies. The territorial disputes, like the Atacama Desert, Tarapacá, I think that's how it is pronounced, it stemmed from unclear colonial era boundaries left behind by Spain. The mineral-rich lands had not been fully mapped or developed under colonial rule, and after independence these zones became flashpoints for national competition. Add to this that some British business companies were like, I like to get involved, and so you end up with guano and salt pepper largely controlled by British investors and companies, while the nations are fighting over territorial disputes. So the Chilean and Peruvian governments relied heavily on foreign capital, and the war ultimately benefited British nitrate interests. So even though no European power fought in this war, European imperialism still shaped it economically. This is often called informal empire, and it's something we still struggle with today in most developing countries. And so this war also deepened internal inequalities in the victorious state, which is Chile. The nitrate wealth enriched a coastal elite, like in Peru, while indigenous and rural communities remained marginalized. And so this reflects a form of internal colonialism, where elites within independent nations exploit peripheral regions, often mimicking colonial patterns of extraction and hierarchy. So anyway, so what does this tell us about displacement? Well, like with technological displacement or technological shifts, where the costs and burdens are simply, displaced from one technology to another, here the same occurs, but between spaces. The contradictions of capital may not appear in Europe or in the US, but that's because they were transferred to the populations of Latin America to deal with. This is, in Saito's word, ecological imperialism, where the costs for the lifestyle that doesn't destroy the environment of the core is transferred to the periphery, where it is destroying the environment there. In short, you destroy the environment of the periphery to sustain the clean environment of the core, your eco-friendly environment that depends on subjugating another environment, exploiting it, and exhausting it. So to quote Saito, as this example makes clear, solving a problem through displacements that benefit only the core constitutes what we now call ecological imperialism. Ecological imperialism relies on the plunder of the periphery while shifting the ill effects of the problem brought about by that plunder back onto the periphery as well. In this way, these actions end up placing even heavier burdens on the local peoples and ecosystems that struggle to sustain themselves, further deepening the severity of the contradictions they were meant to resolve. So in note 21, Saito talks about the notion of ecological imperialism. He says that it's usually associated with American historian Alfred W. Crosby, who wrote a book called Ecological Imperialism, The Biological Expansion of Europe, 900 to 1900 in 1986. But Saito doesn't use the term like in Crosby, but like in Brett Clark and John Bellamy Foster. They use it in their article Ecological Imperialism and the Global Metabolic Rift, Unequal Exchange, and the Guano Nitrates Trade, and a Japanese historian, Fujihara Tatsushi. So the reference he gives for Tatsushi is in Japanese, so I didn't find the translated version of this book, but I did find a book that he edited called The Handbook of Environmental History in Japan, but the only scholar who uses the term ecological imperialism is a guy named John Hayashi. It's in the second chapter, Japan's colonial environments, but the term is based on Crosby's definition. So I couldn't find anything about how Fujihara actually uses the concept, but according to Saito, he uses it in the same way as Clark and Foster. So what's the difference? Well, Crosby uses the term to describe the unintentional but highly consequential biological invasion by Europeans into the other regions of the world, particularly the temperate neo-Europes like North America, South America, Australia, and New Zealand. And so his argument is that European dominance in this area was not primarily due to superior weapons, culture, or economic systems, but rather because of the biological agents like plants, animals, microbes they brought with them. So the imperialism here is biological in that Europeans remade the environments of other lands in their own image by transplanting old world organisms like wheat, cattle, pigs, weeds, smallpox, measles, etc., which allow them to survive and thrive abroad. This helped, displace native peoples and, ecosystems. By conquering the ecosystems through the introduction of new organisms that disrupted the harmony of the indigenous ecosystems, which also includes the introduction of old world, diseases that devastated indigenous populations, especially in the Americas and the Pacific. So the Europeans managed to ecologically dominate their colonies. Saito, however, doesn't use ecological imperialism in Crosby's sense, but in Clark and Foster's. So they use the term as a critical Marxist ecological concept tied to the global metabolic rift created by capitalism. We will explain in greater detail what is a metabolic rift when we talk about Marxist eco-socialism, so Saito's first book. And so Clark and Foster's usage of the term is systematic, political, and economic, and explicitly anti-capitalistic. Unlike Crosby, they focus on the intentional appropriation and destruction of peripheral environments by imperial power, especially Britain. It is part of the capitalist world system, like a core and a periphery dynamic. So for Clark and Foster, ecological imperialism refers to the systemic transfer of ecological value, like nutrients, fertility, biomass, labor, etc., from the global periphery to the core. And so this involves asymmetries in the exploitation of the environment, unequal exchange, and a global metabolic rift. And the consequences of this is the material degradation of the environments in the periphery by the externalization of environmental costs by core capitalist nations back to the periphery. So they define ecological imperialism differently from Crosby. At the end of the article, they identify it with the growth of the center of the capitalist world system at unsustainable rates through the more thoroughgoing ecological degradation of the periphery. So that right there is the spatial shift. When the core shifts its cost onto the periphery, that's basically spatial shift. The last shift now is the temporal, and it follows, the same logic, like, the spatial shift, which transfers the contradictions from one place to another. Temporal shifts transfers it from a period to another. This is what Thunberg was criticizing. When we talked about Greta Thunberg last week, that was her main point. The lifestyle of the boomers was only sustainable because its cost was transferred to the next generation. And we are doing the same thing now. We are letting our kids deal with the cost of our lifestyle. And so Marx already thought of it as well in the context of the overharvesting of forest land. This is when you clear a whole forest to replace it with farmlands or with pasture land. More specifically, it refers to the excessive removal of trees or other forest resources like, timber, fuel wood, or non-timber products at a rate faster than, the forest can actually naturally regenerate. And so Marx immediately foresaw that this will eventually come back to bite us in the ass, even though at his era no one could prove climate change or even suspect it. And so like Saito says, the effects of climate change do not all appear immediately. There is sometimes a time lag of decades before you can witness these effects. Capital uses this lag to reap as much profit as possible from the drilling equipment and pipelines it has already invested the money to create. So even though global warming was unknown to Marx, he could easily see the lands being, slowly depleted, which even though he wouldn't think that this would cause a rise in temperatures, he anticipated that this cannot be good for neither the planet nor humanity. He knew just like, the workers of his time have to deal with the contradictions of capitalism, so will too the future generations. After all, he understood the mindset of capitalists, that nothing matters to them besides their profits. Capitalism reflects the opinions of shareholders and business owners living in the present and therefore ignores the voices of future generations, creating yet another type of externality by shifting the burden of environmental damage to the future. The present generation profits from the sacrifice of future generations. So some fucked up assholes like Nordhaus welcome this as good news because remember, time is money, and as long as there is money, there is markets and innovation, which means, it's only a matter of time before we get to the miracle technology that will spare us this damage. So Nordhaus would argue that his future kids will live in a time where technology would have advanced, and so they will figure something out. Technological progress will take care of, the problem for us. So no need to worry, and don't you dare cut carbon dioxide emissions so severely that it would have a negative impact on the economy. But as Saito points, even if this miracle Deus Ex Machina technology is invented, it would be at the cost of so many lives already. And not only that, but if Nordhaus thinks that once we find that technology, then it will be immediately adopted effectively across society, he doesn't certainly understand how capitalism works. Adopting that technology everywhere will take a lot of time. It will take a long time. I mean, for God's sake, even today, not everyone has Wi-Fi or electricity or even a phone line. We know that the most privileged would prefer restraining access to that technology as much as they possibly could so that they won't lose a single penny in the process. So not only Nordhaus wants to wait patiently for a hypothetical new technology, but even when we find it, we also need to wait even more so that everyone who could avoid the climate crisis, which by the way is not going to be waiting for us, okay? By the time we find that, again, hypothetical technology and adapt it to society as a whole, the climate crisis would have been worsened so much that countless ones of us have already died. And no matter how you try to look at it, this promise of a new miracle technology will end in betrayal, in Saito's words. So again, Nordhaus wants us to wait and have faith in the market on two levels. First, he wants us to believe that the market will find that technology and find it in time. And second, he wants us to believe that it will catch up to the speed at which the crisis is worsening, otherwise we'll be doomed. And by all, it's all of humanity, including future generations. And let's also not forget that the more the crisis continues, the worse the economy will get. Inequalities will rise, and the number of people living in poverty will increase, while the number of the rich getting smaller, while the riches at the top get, richer and richer. And so this is what Nordhaus wants us to bet on, to hope that 1. The climate crisis will not impact negatively the economy until it, 2nd, finds this miracle technology in time, and 3, it will be adopted faster to everyone than the crisis is worsening. Yeah, no, I'm not betting on that, because what's the most likely to happen if you are a sane person is the following. In other words, future generations will not only be consigned to live in extreme cruel conditions, but their economic situations will also be dire. This is perhaps the worst possible outcome of all, one that constitutes the most compelling reason not to leave climate change to be solved by technology, but rather to stop it here and now by addressing its root cause. So, all this to say that capital was, is, and always will be displacing the negative effects of its workings onto the periphery that it creates. Without it, there won't be capitalism. It's an essential feature for it to exist. So no matter how much money or ideas you throw at it, it will never solve the climate crisis, since it will always rely on a periphery. And I think we've already demonstrated how, in relation to capitalism, having a periphery will ultimately lead to global warming and environmental destruction. It's like, you can say, well, how about we make capitalism so that it can have a periphery but doesn't destroy the environment? Again, having a periphery means exploiting it to exhaustion. It means plundering its resources and giving it nothing back. It is ecological destruction. And not just that, the periphery finds itself having to deal with that destruction. We said many times already that the periphery faces a double burden: destruction and the cost of that destruction. It's like, someone destroys your house and you are the one who has to build it back. As a result, the periphery faces a double burden. After suffering from the plundering of ecological imperialism, it finds itself forced to bear an unequal burden of the destructive effects of capitalism's displacements. So, Saito offers a concrete example, which is quite recent because it involves the COVID pandemic. This is in Chile, in Latin America, where a huge part of its land is used to cultivate avocados. But why? Do the people of Chile need avocados? Is it like, some sort of a main dish for them? Well, no. Most of the avocados produced in Chile isn't even going to be consumed by Chileans. It's cultivated for export for the countries in the global north. Okay, it is cultivated for export. Now, are avocados a necessity? Well, no. They are exported to northern countries to promote healthy lifestyles so that, Instagram models can be thin and make videos about how healthy they are and how all they consume is natural and shit. This is the imperial mode of living right here. And so the consumption habits in the global north, often framed as sustainable, organic, healthy, it actually relies on extractive resource use in the global south. Avocados have become a trendy superfood in Europe, in the US, and even in Japan. However, the ecological and social costs of their production are borne by exploiting countries like Chile, like Mexico, like Peru. These avocados work like a fetish in the Marxist sense. So a fetish, in Marxist terminology, is when a commodity hides the class struggle behind it and involved in its production process. Saito gives a straight example when he refers to how avocados are called in Japan. They are called the butter of forests. And so such an expression is basically sugarcoating. It mystifies the commodity so that we don't see what it costs, because the story behind that motherfucking fruit is wild. First, avocados require a huge amount of water to grow. Like, it's crazy how much it needs. It's not something that you should make a business of. if you give a shit about water. Not only that, it also consumes so much of the nutrients in the soil that if you grow avocados on some land, you cannot grow anything else after that. Like, let's say that again. Cultivating avocados on such a massive scale requires a huge amount of water that is being wasted and extreme soil depletion. As you can guess, this can lead to severe droughts and water shortages for local populations because water is often, diverted from rivers, springs, and underground sources through privatized rights, thanks to Chile's Pinochet-era water code, which, contributes to more droughts and conflicts with local populations. In places like Petorca, some communities rely on water trucks, while nearby avocado farms are lush and green. And so this situation became more absurd during the COVID pandemic because if there is a period where you shouldn't waste water, it's when you have a sanitary crisis on your hands. Water is by nature precious, but when you have a pandemic, water becomes indispensable to combat, for hand washing and hygiene, but instead, in Chile, it was used to grow more avocados to export during the fucking pandemic. Why? Well, because of the privatization of the water supply during the Pinochet era. So here too, Saito gives a Japanese article from a scholar named Mori Sayaka, but I couldn't find it in English, so I couldn't read it. But anyways, it's also another reason why you should never privatize anything close to natural resources, especially something like water supply, because that's what those private companies will use for, when there are droughts or sanitary crises for their own benefits. Like Saito says, in other words, Chile has sacrificed its own water supply and its capacity to produce its own food to cultivate this export crop. This is a perfect example of how the core exploits the periphery and displaces all the negative effects of its lifestyle and ideology onto the periphery. In capitalism, the most vulnerable are always the ones who must bear. They must bear the costs of everything. Now, don't let anyone fool you with those bullshit phrases like the CEO takes all of the risks. It's not true. It's always the most vulnerable who take all of the risks. So, everything bad that happens in capitalist economies, all the consequences of climate change by the consumerist lifestyle of the global north, the deleterious effects of the COVID pandemic, all of that is borne by the most vulnerable. And Saito sums it up perfectly at the beginning of this next section. The word will end before capitalism does. He writes, "One way to see the situation is as one in which risk and chance are distributed extremely unequally. The periphery must always lose so that the core may win." So this can, of course, be good news for capitalism because it is sure to win, right? The core can always remain reassured because none of its negative consequences will fall back on it. Everything will go to the periphery. However, this would be feasible if the periphery is infinite. But like we noted before, at one point, the core will run out of peripheries to externalize its shit back into. Sooner or later, the core will too be hit with the negative effects as well, and thus it cannot hide its contradictions anymore. But by that time, it would be too late. If the periphery completely dies, then there is no way to stop the Earth from dying. What Saito is trying to say here is that the Earth will die before capitalism dies. Marx was right in predicting that capitalism will eventually die because at one point it can no longer hide its contradictions. That's when, the proletariat, the proletariat revolts bring the revolution, because capitalism arrives at its limits where it can no longer, fetishizes its contradictions. Saito's point, however, is bleaker. If Marx thought that capitalism will eventually and logically die from its remains, communism will rise, Saito argues that capitalism is killing the planet quicker than it is killing itself. Like, we cannot wait for capitalism to run out of peripheries to displace its contradictions, because by that time the world would have probably ended. Saito says it perfectly. To put it another way, by the time people in developed countries are ready to look the problem in the face, it will already be too late to save the ecology of this limited planet. The Earth will become uninhabitable for humankind before capitalism collapses. The famous American environmental activist Bill McKibben puts it this way. The diminished availability of fossil fuel is not the only limit we face. In fact, it's not even the most important. Even before we run out of oil, we are running out of planet. This quote still holds true if we replace the words fossil fuel and oil with the word capitalism. We must remember that if the planet fails, it's game over for humanity. There is no planet B. So that quote comes from McKibben's book, Deep Economy, The Wealth of Communities and the Durable Future, on page 18. It's the first words of the fourth section of chapter 1, After Growth. And if we do, as Saito says, and replace those words with capitalism, we get the following quote: the diminished availability of capitalism isn't the only limit we face. In fact, it's not even the most important. Even before we run out of capitalism, we are running out of planet. And I think it's clear. Like with fossil fuel and oil, the problem isn't that we are running out of it, or rather that there isn't enough fossil fuel or oil to burn. The problem is that the amount that we already have is enough to render the planet completely uninhabitable. Like, we won't be able to use all of it. We will destroy ourselves with the amount we already extracted before extracting all of it. And so the same is true for capitalism. The world will collapse before capitalism does, because it cannot bear the stress that we are putting on it, that we have been putting on it since the last 300 years of economic growth. And for what? As McKibben says at the beginning of the second section, it's because economic growth doesn't mean shit. In his words, the median wage in the United States is the same as it was 30 years ago. The real income of the bottom 90% of American taxpayers has declined steadily. They earned $27,000 and $27,060 in 1979 annually, back to $25,646 in 2005. Even for those with 4-year college degrees, and even though productivity was growing faster than it has for decades, earnings fell by 5.2% between 2000 and 2004, when adjusted for inflation. So what does it mean to have economic growth? Well, clearly not that our lives are getting better. Even more, we are ruining the planet for its sake. Scientists everywhere are telling us that human actions are depleting Earth's natural capital, putting such a strain on the environment that the ability of the planet's ecosystem to sustain future generation can no longer be taken for granted, that if not checked, many of our current practices may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that in the ways that we know of. And so this is from McKibben's book. He's comparing these warnings from scientists to the doctor clearing his throat and asking you to sit down. But of course, our attitude is like that of a patient diagnosed with cancer and who continues smoking nonetheless. Now, just to be clear, when we say the periphery is dying, it doesn't mean that peripheries don't treat other peripheries in the same way. Just like within independent nations, you can have colonial-like behavior, peripheries can also act like the core towards other peripheries. This is, by the way, how we run out of peripheries. It's not like the global north keeps exploiting and externalizing its contradictions to the global south, as if the south is only receptive and passive in this process. The developing countries like China and Brazil, they do the same. For a long time, they have been the repositories of displacement for the developed world, but then they too want to compete with the North on terms of economic growth. They too want economies to be as performing as their developed competitors. You often hear, for example, developing countries are already affected by climate change dismiss ecological measures, saying that it is a conspiracy or a plan from the global north to prevent us to also develop economically. So these countries too act with the same economist mindset. The years of colonization and exploitation, the years of neo-colonialism, the years of attracting, foreign investors, was also that, they too can develop technologies that allow them to access the global market. So telling China and Brazil to care about the environment comes off as a way of telling them that all of those sacrifices and burdens you endured from the hand of the white man, and you hoped to turn to your advantage, well, now you cannot do that. So of course, these countries will be like, fuck off, and they will double down on ecological burdens. They act like the core, and so they too need peripheries to externalize their contradictions too. Except that since these are countries that are still struggling from a colonial past and are still peripheries to the north, they are more ruthless towards their own peripheries, which, by the way, are also dealing with the global north. The periphery of China is both having to endure China's externalization, but also the UK's or any other country from the north, which only results in the acceleration of the periphery's exhaustion, which circles back to what we said: the world will eventually die before capitalism dies. And so this is more like what's going to happen. Developing countries would want to increasingly devote themselves to their own high-speed economic developments, but as they do, Saito writes, the available space on the planet to use as convenient outside for externalization and displacement shrinks into almost nothing. It's logically impossible for all these countries to externalize the contradictions of their development at the same time. But the lack of an outside constitutes a death blow for our externalization society. So this is yet another contradiction of capitalism. Like I said, for it to work, it requires a core and a periphery in order to make profits. But it also means that not everyone can be the core. If you have only cores but no peripheries, then you cannot make profits. You need those frontiers from which you can extract cheap labor. You need a poor space that has resources and cheap labor. Without that, profit rates will drop, which means that you will have to become even more ruthless towards your exploited workers to squeeze out as much surplus value as you can. That's why a periphery will be technically more ruthless towards its own periphery, because since it is a periphery, it is being exploited, and so its profit rates are going to be less than those of the core. So it needs to extract more surplus value than the core in order to make a profit. So it has to overexploit its own periphery, which means that it dies more quickly. So the periphery of the periphery dies, which makes leaves the latter vulnerable to the core again. Having itself no periphery to externalize its burden to, it will soon join its victim. You cannot logically have everyone be a winner in capitalism in this game, because the winner requires someone to lose, and by losing we mean taking from him everything that you can steal. So it is from the start a rigged game, but a game that cannot go indefinitely. As we said, once all of the peripheries die, the contradictions won't have anywhere to be hidden. They'll go back like a tsunami of all the trash humans throw in the ocean and hit the core. The core will then look like the devastated periphery, Poverty will rise, the middle classes will crumble and collapse, and start feeling the worsening of their economic conditions directly on the one hand, and the consequences of climate change on the other. Storms, heat waves, droughts, hurricanes, and typhoons, all the good stuff that is basically now routine in the global south. Once that happened, the global north can no longer ignore those, issues and, dismissing them as someone else's problems. But like we said, by that time it would be too late. The damage will be so great that even the most powerful cannot do anything about it. We have only one Earth, as Saito reminds us, and there are no dreams to colonize Mars. This is an apocalyptic future that we are heading towards if we don't understand this fundamental dynamic from Wallerstein's word system, this dynamic between core and periphery. We have to understand that everything that we do have consequences that we will have to face sooner or later. There was a time where we thought that the plastic will disappear into the ocean, that the vast blue will that seems infinite will take care of it, and so this vast great unknown beyond us, this great beyond will take care of plastic. But that plastic we thought is going to disappear, and so we throw in the seas and oceans, now comes back in the form of microplastic in our seafood and water supply. We likewise thought that the smoke that comes out of the factories simply dissipates into the air, like the air takes it away. But all of that carbon dioxide has come back in the form of extreme weather events, of like daily heat waves, hurricanes, and wildfires. So these changes in the planet's behavior also force us into acting on instinct and reduce us to our base animal-like behavior that threatens even our democracies. The climate change that the North has engineered from its economic system has not just caused severe exploitation of peripheries, but even their political destabilization. Countries like Syria, that suffered from civil wars for over decades, partly because of climate change. In 2006, Syria experienced one of the worst droughts in its modern history, all the way to 2010. The drought devastated northeastern Syria, the country's main agricultural region, and so over 1.5 million people, mostly farmers and herders, were forced to migrate to urban areas like Damascus, Aleppo, and Homs due to crop failure and livestock loss. And so the influx of displacement to rural populations increased urban unemployment, housing shortages, and competition for basic resources. The Assad regime's neoliberal economic reforms, including cutting fuel and food subsidies around the same time, made conditions worse for the poor and rural populations, which also played a huge role in causing the civil war, along with foreign interventions, of course. This resulted in the Syrian migrant crisis, where thousands of refugees from Syria tried to escape to Europe, where they were met with growing hostility from right-wing populists whose influence and power keeps growing every day. Now even democracies are threatened. So there's a footnote there, but the reference is an article in German from a journal that you have to pay in order to read. So I couldn't read it because it is also in German, and you also have to pay, the tablet or the newspaper. So I don't know what it's about, but I found a report by Amnesty International with the same title. So if you read German, you can give it a read. I'll put it in the description with the link. The title is Auf der Flansch vor dem Klima. I think that my pronunciation is bad. I know, because I don't read German, but I had someone who helped me through it a little bit. So it's about immigration caused by climate change, especially in the global south. It addresses how rising temperatures, sea level rise, droughts, floods, and other climate-related disasters are forcing millions of people to leave their homes. The title means fleeing from the climate. So people are leaving their homes in Bangladesh, in sub-Saharan Africa, and small island states, and their number keeps increasing, which presents a unique challenge for humanitarian action, because turns out there is no clear legal framework under international refugee law to protect people displaced by climate-related causes, because they do not fit the conventional definition of a refugee. This fact can give the developed countries all pretexts to oppress those refugees, since they are under no legal obligation to give a shit about them. And so they can avoid all responsibility. Because let's not forget that it is the countries to which the refugees are migrating that are mostly responsible for greenhouse gas emissions that destroyed those people's homes. So the European Union, for example, has its own sinister way to deal with the migrant crisis. It can put pressure on other countries that serve as transit. That is, a country that immigrants need to cross in order to get to their destination. For Syrian refugees, for example, Turkey is their transit. They need to cross Turkey in order to get to Europe. So the European Union can pressure Turkey to intercept these migrants and detain them. And the same, by the way, is happening here in Tunisia, where the Italian fascist government of Meloni pressured Said into the Tunisian government, so pressured Said, with his compliance of course, into deploying inhumane measures against sub-Saharan immigrants. And, you know, like as the pussy he is, he said, okay. So the same happened, and it is still happening within the border crisis in the USA, and where we are all, I mean, we've all seen the footages of the detention camps and how horrifying, similar to Nazi concentration camps, they look like. As Saito says, the USA don't only have to deal with the intense weather events like hurricanes and shit, which again they produced by farting carbon dioxide over and over again from the 1950s, but they also played a pivotal role in the violence increase and political instability in Mexico. So thousands of Mexicans, they try to pass the border by caravans of refugees from Honduras, I think that's how it is pronounced. And like Saito points, they're not trying to go to the US just to flee from the violence and political oppression, but no, they are not. And no, they are not just, you know, after welfare or to sell drugs. They also leave because they keep having bad harvests due to climate change. Another article Saito mentions in note 25, this time in English, is from The Guardian. It's the unseen driver behind the migrant caravan, climate change. Again, it's about, you know, climate change being an enormous reason for people migrating, besides, you know, fleeing violence and poverty. In the case of Mexico, while many say that the immigrants are fleeing gang violence or poverty, the authors of the article argue that many of them are farmers who cannot stay on their land because climate change rendered them useless. Many report that they are that they are leaving their countries. They are leaving their country because. So they're leaving Mexico because of repeated crop failures due to repetitive droughts, because of lack of rain and changes in weather patterns. So the changes in climate also make the crops vulnerable to diseases. For example, the article mentions that since around 2012, coffee plants across Central America have been ravaged by an epidemic of leaf rust. It is a fungal disease that affects wheat, barley, rice stems, leaves and grains, leading to severe crop loss. And according to some estimates, it has affected 70% of farms in Central America. And so these epidemics are also caused by the changes in temperature during the seasons, because normally the fungus dies when temperatures go down in evenings and nights. But since temperatures are rising, it thrives longer on the leaves and consumes them. So some manage to leave with their families, while others have to leave with their wives and children behind, and hope that in the US they can get a job and send them money. So it's common for those families to take out their kids from school because they can no longer afford to pay for their, you know, school supplies. And of course, as we said, these immigrants aren't considered refugees, because to be a refugee, you need to flee from war or political persecution. A refugee of climate change doesn't exist, legally speaking. And so this allows politicians like Trump to exploit them for political gain and gaining votes by demonizing them as if they weren't, you know, vulnerable enough. We all remember how Trump responded back in 2019. He detained them in miserable conditions, denying them access to the country and calling for the building of a border wall. And I think it was Sorry, if you think that it was easier under Biden, well, you are wrong, because I bet that Kamala Harris would have deployed ICE. So these are also strategies to maintain the myth that capitalism works. The arrival of refugees at the border is basically, the contradictions becoming apparent. Pushing back the immigrants is capitalism desperate attempts to keep the veil up, that the imperial mode of living can and must be preserved. But as Saito says, but this sort of literal displacement cannot continue forever. Climate change and climate refugees render the previously invisible contradictions of the developed world's imperial mode of living visible as concrete objects and bodies, and threaten to overturn the prevailing order once and for all. So we get to the conclusion of the first chapter. Now we are getting a reality check. All the strategies, the coping mechanisms, the lies that we are telling ourselves, they are reached their limits. For Saito, the time of proclaiming "Après moi le déluge" is done. Après moi le déluge, it's a French expression that means after me the flood. Sometimes it's après nous, after us, and it is a nihilistic expression that means that I don't care what happens after I'm gone. After I'm dead, the world can burn and collapse for all I care. So it's said to have originated in the 18th century during Louis XV's reign, after the Battle of Rosbach, which is a battle between France and the Holy Roman Empire and the Prussian Kingdom. And France lost that battle, and it was, a disaster for France. So the phrase might have originated then from Madame de Pompadour, who said it to the king to reassure him. It's like saying, "Don't worry, because once we die, none of it will matter." But it has many origin story. Marx too actually uses it in his 10th chapter of Das Kapital, first volume, to describe the mindset of a capitalist. He says, "Après moi le déluge" is the watchword of every capitalist and every capitalist nation. And indeed, in front of the climate crisis, it is fitting. A capitalist doesn't give a damn what happens after he dies. He doesn't think of future generations or other people. All he cares about is the present moment, the short-term value he can squeeze out of the periphery. However, Saito argues that now the flood is here. We can no longer pretend that it is not, that it is still, in some sort of great beyond, or that we still have time to make that one last profit. The contradictions of the imperial mode of living have nowhere to be hidden, and so we have to take responsibility for it and face, this harsh reality. We need to understand the different possible futures ahead of us and do what is necessary to choose the right one. As we mentioned the US and Europe's mishandling of the migrant crisis, we can see a possible future there. A rise in nationalism and right-wing politics that take advantage of the climate crisis to fulfill their racist agendas. They can find the perfect excuse to ethnically cleanse populations with the risk of food shortages, energy crisis, and more refugees coming to take refuge from the floods and droughts that the North has caused on their lands. Right-wing politics can use these issues to further strengthen their fascist and xenophobic causes and visions. And so this will lead to a collapse of democracies, and authoritarian leaders will take over. And so this scenario is called climate fascism. And so this seems to be the future we are heading towards. But it doesn't have to be. We still have the opportunity to take a different route. Climate change, by putting us in front of our responsibility and the consequences of our behavior, can push us towards another direction. One in which we give support for movements of solidarity for a more just world and a radical transformation of our lifestyle. So that option is still available. Will we choose that option? Well, nothing is certain here, but what we can be sure of is that we are getting closer to the turning point where capitalism is about to collapse and we will be facing systemic chaos, in which this is a situation where we must make a choice. And this, in Wallerstein's words, is the moment of bifurcation. To quote Saito, "The exhaustion of the periphery is bringing us all closer to a historic turning point that will render the present system unable to function." Right before he passed away, Wallerstein said, "The past normality of externalization is a distant memory." If externalization can no longer occur, neither can the accumulation of capital, at least not how it has occurred up until now. The environmental crisis will also continue to worsen. As a result, the justification for the continuation of the capitalist system will be undercut, and resistant movements opposing that system will gain strength and magnitude. So the reference to Wallerstein is in note 26. It's in the 2013 book, Does Capitalism Have a Future?, which he co-wrote with several other scholars, including Michael Mann, the guy we mentioned last time. So the externalization is a distant memory is on page 23 of the book, in the chapter by Wallerstein, Structural Crisis, and it's pretty straightforward. It basically says that now externalization is no longer possible and it is not an efficient way to do things anymore. For a long time, about 300 years or 500 years, we've normalized externalization because we took for granted making profit, and profits can only be made through externalization. Wallerstein goes into more details. He says that first, that profit is first made through a differential between costs of production and prices. The lower the costs and the higher the sales price, and so the more profit is realized and can be reinvested. But we need to ask, how can the differential between costs and sales price be maximized? And so for Wallerstein, you can do that in two ways, either by a monopoly or minimizing costs. And it's the second way that is relevant here. If you want to see what he has to say about monopoly, it's in the section Capitalism During Its Phase of Normal Operation. And basically, monopolies, or quasi-monopolies, not to be precise, are self-liquidating over time and don't really address the externalization as much as minimizing costs. So let's look at that. So there are three types of costs in production, according to Wallerstein. There is personal costs, costs of inputs, and taxation. Wallerstein says in personal costs, the producer or the owner has to pay three kinds of personnel: the unskilled and semi-skilled workforce, the skilled workers, and the supervisory cadres, I think that's how it is pronounced in English. I have the term in French in my mind, so cadre, I'm gonna say cadre. And then you have the top managers, okay? So this is in personal costs. Personnel costs, so staff costs, okay? This is the staff that you have to pay. So the unskilled workforce, that is the working class, those you can easily exploit and have nothing but their workforce to sell. They're also the least paid, of course, but eventually they realize that they are being cheated, and so they organize in syndical actions and start raising their demands. If you agree to those demands, well, your costs will go up because, you know, among those demands, there are going to be, you know, higher wages, for example, or, you know, higher wages, shorter working hours, you know, more holidays, etc. So to avoid that, you appeal to the runaway factory. That is, you relocate to a historically lower wage area. You go to a rural area, for example, and you recruit peasants who are willing to work for an even lower wage than the urban workforce. Okay, these can also be areas in underdeveloped countries. So basically, you create a periphery. However, these newly workers eventually become, you know, knowledgeable about what is going on, and they too start organizing in syndical actions, meaning that you have to relocate again to an even lower wage area. But these processes virtually exhaust the areas, you know, what Wallerstein called the loci or loci, L-O-C-I, and so this causes what he calls a deruralization of the world's system. It means that the periphery shrinks even more. Okay, you have less and less poor rural areas until there is no poor rural areas, and rural areas are always, you know, the periphery here. So at the same time, you try to avoid raising the costs of the unskilled workforce. So that's the first point. So you also find yourself having to raise that of the skilled workers and cadres. That's because one, the constantly increased scale of productive units requires more intermediate personnel to coordinate it, and so that's what the cadres do. The cadres, they are here to, they serve as an intermediate between the top managers and the unskilled force. And second, their job is also to ruin syndical action. Okay, this is the job of those intermediate personnel. Here by cadre, I don't mean, you know, artists, teachers, engineers, nurses, lawyers, because technically those are also cadre and skilled workers. Instead, I mean jobs in like HR, you know, regional managers like Michael Scott, for example, executives, etc. These are what David Graeber calls bullshit jobs. So the creation of this larger intermediate stratum composed of the cadre, who can be both, you know, political allies for the ruling stratum, and, you know, they spread the belief of a possible upward mobility for the unskilled majority. This allows them to blunt the political mobilization of that majority. But this intermediate stratum costs even more money. And then, you know, there are the managers who cost even more. And thereby, you know, they reduce what goes to the owner, the shareholder, as profits, or to the firm for reinvestment. However, the owners, they accept to deal with managers and, you know, this intermediate stratum, since they allow them to, you know, repress the demands of the unskilled workforce and exploit them. And so thereby, they reduce their overall costs. Like it's cheaper for the owner to spend money on the intermediate stratum and on top managers than, you know, on meeting the demands or agreeing to the demands of the unskilled workforce. So owners make thus more money by paying for the strata than by agreeing to the workforce's demands. Then, so that's for the personnel costs. Then there are the input costs, which are the use of raw material in the process of production. And so how can you reduce costs here? Well, the strategy is precisely externalization. Wallerstein says about externalization that it is an elegant way of saying that you are not paying the full bill for the inputs that you use. You just, for example, pay for the extraction of the input, but you don't pay to clean the waste it leaves from the process. So you externalize that cost. But then it means that someone else has to pay for the rest of the bill, right? Someone needs to clean the waste. And so for Wallerstein, there are also three main costs to externalize: the disposal of toxic waste, the renewal of raw materials, and the construction of the necessary infrastructures for transport and communications. So for a long time, this is how we've been doing things, and no one questioned this validity of the system. It was seen as completely normal. And yes, in order to make profits, in order to reduce costs, you need to exploit workers and externalize input costs, make someone else pay for the rest of your bill. But the reason why we have normalized this behavior is because until recently, we always thought that there is always some sort of vacant public domain in which, you know, we can dump our waste. But now we start to see the limit. The deruralization of the world's workforce means the ruling out of new groups of potential low-wage workers to exploit, and the disappearance of places in which to dump our waste. And so the periphery is disappearing, and so we cannot hide the externalization process anymore. If many decades ago we could turn our heads, you know, from the voices of social movements because there was still some sort of vacant space, now we have nowhere to turn our heads. Everywhere we look, we find exhausted peripheries and an anger that we can no longer ignore, gaslight, or contain. And so this, of course, has led to more demands on taxation, but we don't need to dive into that, which is the third type of cost in Wallerstein, because taxation isn't really going to solve the problem anyway, since it allows for business to keep accumulated indefinite capital as long as it can pay the tax. But money isn't going to restore, you know, the exhausted lands or, you know, clean the air or oceans. It cannot bring back the extinct species and restore the ecosystems. It can work, you know, if the taxation forces capitalists into investing money of their most of their money, you know, in the welfare state, like like in education, health services, life revenue flows, because that's the point of taxation after all, but it won't work in a capitalist setting. It's also, something that we will go back to in the next chapter, by the way, because in the next chapter we will talk about taxation. So anyway, so for these reasons, Wallerstein asserts that the three basic costs of production have risen constantly and have now reached they have now reached close enough to their asymptotes that the system cannot be brought back to equilibrium via the multiple mechanisms that we have been using for the last 500 years or so. So the possibilities for producers to achieve an endless accumulation of capital seems to be ending, which means that we are now going to have to radically change our ways. We are now at that bifurcation point. The periphery has reached its exhaustion limits, and so we are at a turning point in which history, in history where we have to choose a path between chaos or a different mode of of existence, a different, more stable social system. And so here, again, Saito refers to Wallerstein in note 27, this time to his book, Word System Analysis and Introduction, more precisely to the first 2 pages of the chapter, The Modern Word System in Crisis, Bifurcation, Chaos and Choices. In there, Wallerstein highlights again that capitalism as a word system has reached its end. Just like any other word system, he has, he says that word systems, they have lives, they come into existence, and at some point in time in space, they live, and then eventually they die. They die because they eventually and inevitably approach asymptotes that aggravate considerably their internal contradictions. That is, the system encounters problems it can no longer resolve, and this causes what we may call a systemic crisis. And Wallerstein insists on this, that a crisis isn't just some difficult period, but a period where the system has met a difficulty that cannot be resolved within the framework of that system, because they are actually parts of that system, all right? The difficulties are part of the system, and so instead they can be overcome only by going outside of that system or beyond that historical system. This means that they can only be overcome by another word system, and this is the point of bifurcation. Wallerstein adopts it from the technical language of natural sciences. In natural science, when a system bifurcates, it means that its basic equations can be solved in 2 different ways. Translate into everyday language, we can say that the system is faced with 2 alternative solutions for its crisis, both of which are intrinsically possible. And Wallerstein says the members of the system collectively are called upon to make a historical choice about which of the alternative paths will be followed, what kind of new system will be constructed. So from the ruins of capitalism, only a few alternatives are possible, and Rosa Luxemburg highlighted only 2 options, either barbarism or socialism. But Saito says, and we will come back to these, he predicts 4 possible outcomes, 4 possible word systems for the future. So Saito says, he calls this point of bifurcation the great divergence of the 21st century, where only 2 options lie ahead of us. And so what is it going to be? Is it going to be barbarism or socialism? That's the famous Rosa Luxemburg slogan, which you can find in her famous The Junius pamphlet at the end of chapter 1. When she wrote the pamphlet, it was in 1915, and it's an anti-war pamphlet against World War I and the instrumentalization of the working class to foster nationalism and patriotism to encourage the war effort. Lenin will also make similar statement in the opening of his 1917 Unfinished State and Revolution, where he says that German nationalists who spent their existence fighting and destroying Marx and Marxism, once he died, they co-opted his theories and emptied them of all revolutionary content and used it as an icon to support their own ideologies. They start to use Marx in a way to gain support from the working classes so that they can use them as soldiers in the war. So anyways, in the pamphlet, Luxemburg says that humankind is faced between two futures: socialism or barbarism. Actually, she doesn't say that, but she's quoting Engels, who said that bourgeois society stands at the crossroads, either transition to socialism or regression into barbarism, which is actually a misquote. Engels never said that, but he could have had. And what Luxemburg means by socialism is the realization of humanity's full potential, or more precisely, humanity's consciousness and free will through the mastery of the environment, opposed to the barbarism of the First World War, which is, the direct result of capitalist way of life of the bourgeoisie. So what she means by socialism is a rational way for humans to interact with their environment so that they can attain freedom from famine, diseases, and wars. Mastery over the environment, here as Saito says, is more aligned with the Marxist notion of metabolism than Prometheanism, which again, these are notions that we will see after the third chapter, because they are going to be very important to understand Marxists' critique of capitalism from an ecological point of view, and what is degrowth communism, which we have been teasing since the first episode. So it's either we bring socialism, a rational metabolic interaction with nature, which will bring about humanity's full potential, consciousness, and freedom, or a future of barbarism, which is a Hobbesian nightmare of a war against all, which is what's most likely to happen if we continue to plunder the world's resources. So since these are the two options that we have, it is crucial to ask how we can avoid barbarism. And according to Saito, we are in such a dire situation that we cannot afford to count on reform in an incrementalist approach. Incrementalist means that you bring about change through small steps. We cannot do that anymore because we don't have the time. We need a structural and radical change right now. And so in the next chapter, Saito is going to analyze one such attempt to bring significant change, but it's an attempt that sadly doesn't work because, as radical as it may sound first, it still makes concessions with capitalism. And so next time we will examine one such attempt, the hope offered by the Green New Deal proposed in Europe and the United States. That's it for this chapter. We will stop here, and as I said, next week we will start reading from the second chapter about the Green New Deal, or about Green Keynesianism, and we will see how that also fails as an alternative to the current system, because it doesn't want to overthrow capitalism, but it just tries to amend it, to reform it in some ways that it can still be capitalism, but without destroying the environment through the intervention of the state. So anyways, this is it for today. I hope that you found this video interesting. As always, subscribe, leave a comment, like the video, and as always,